Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you are in. My name is Charles Kupchan. I am a professor in the School of Foreign Service and the Government Department at Georgetown. It's my pleasure to be moderating our discussion today, which will focus on Germany-China relations in the post-Merkel era. We have three excellent participants to engage in a discussion. Obviously, it will range more broadly than just Germany and China. We're a couple of days after the first real conversation between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, so there's a lot in play right now. And to get us going into these issues, we have Bernhard Bartsch, who is at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. We have Eberhard Sandschneider, who is currently at Berlin Global Advisors, formerly DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and also a professor at the Free University in Berlin. And finally, we have Didi Tatlow, who is at DGAP. We're going to start off with around 5 to 7 minutes of introductory comments by our three participants. I'll then engage them in a conversation for another 20 minutes or so. We're then going to open the floor to all of you. You should use the Q&A function to pose questions. I will be moderating the Q&A and collating the questions and posing them to our participants. So without further ado, let me welcome everybody to the panel. Let me simply thank our three sponsoring institutions, the Asian Studies Program at Georgetown, the BMW Center for European Studies at Georgetown, as well as the Institute for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, also part of Georgetown's global outreach. To get us going, I'm going to ask Bernhard to make some opening comments. Bernhard, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Merix in Berlin. I want to use my opening statement to make three quick points to start our discussion. First, what is our current analysis of China? Second, what kind of China policy are we coming from the Merkel era? And thirdly, what can we anticipate from the new government? Firstly, our current analysis of China, I think we need to assess that how we view China from Germany and Europe has changed dramatically in the last couple of years, from a China that Germany engaged with vigorously, mostly economically, to a China that is much more on a path of turning inwards, that has become much more autocratic, that has become much more worrying politically for us, but that most importantly pursues a whole different view of globalization than it did for the most part of the Merkel era. It's a China that has industrial and innovation and general economic policies that are geared towards being far less welcoming to foreign companies, German companies in China. And that means that from the perspective of Germany and the German economy, the long-held view that whatever is good for a German company in China is also good for Germany as an economy no longer holds true. And we can go into that in the discussion, but the view of China has really fundamentally changed to much towards competition. And you probably know the European view of looking at China as, of course, a partner, but much more a competitor now and a systemic rival. So today's China is no longer the China that we thought we were dealing with for the most part of the Merkel era. Happy to go into details, but I think it's important to assess that to start off. Because any discussion that we have about our engagement with China has a lot to do with how we view China and its trajectory and our trajectory together. Now, the Merkel era, not going through all the 16 years, for the last years, there has been a strong tension between, on the one hand, keeping engagement with China going, and on the other hand, tendencies to be much more vocal about the issues and differences that we have with China. Angela Merkel's view was very much informed by, in the last years, the shock of the Trump years and the realization that Europe and Germany is in danger of being squeezed between two superpowers, and that led to the conclusion that Germany should be very careful not to be forced to pick sides. There was the other camp that said that the answer would need to be to invest much more into European solidarity, into engagement with other Indo-Pacific nations, diversifying Germany's trade relations, also investing more into the transatlantic partnership. Angela Merkel did not invest in the last years as heavily into European sovereignty as many would have wished. Now, what can we expect from the new government? Three quick points there, how we could look at that. If we look at their election platforms, and if we look at what we currently know about the coalition agreement, which is probably going to be published next week, then the language is much more robust than it used to be in all the three parties that are probably going to form the next government. So if you look at election platforms and the coalition treaty, that would, we could anticipate that there's going to be a shift in German-China policy towards making it a much more European approach, a more transatlantic approach, and being much more clear-eyed and vocal about the differences and issues that we have with China. Now that is one driver. If we look at the topics that the three coalition parties most care about, then I think the assessment must be that none of the three parties really have an interest to change China policy just for the sake of changing China policy. The Social Democrats, Olaf Scholz personally, he cares internationally about multinational institutions. That's what he's been engaged with as Minister of Finance. And it could be argued that in international finance and finance policy, China has actually been a decent partner. His personal relationship with Chinese counterparts, but also from his time as mayor in Shanghai, everything you hear is quite positive, and no real reason, and especially no quick wins there to change policy. For the Greens, the decisive issue is climate change. Again, there we've seen in Glasgow that the West and China are at least not bitter adversaries there, and very much trying to find a joint cooperative agenda there, which is difficult. Again, we can't go into that, but no quick wins there for any change of policy. For the Liberal Democrats, it's mostly about economic and technological competitiveness. And again, there, China, of course, for German businesses, plays a big role and will remain to play a big role. So if you look at the topics that the major parties most care about, no real driver for change there. The third issue there, and I think that's going to be the decisive one, is what kind of conflicts can we anticipate? And I think it's fair to say that in the last years, German China policy and European China policy has always moved forward and developed when there were specific conflicts that political solutions were needed for. It started with the KUKA investment, which put the whole issue of investment screening on the agenda, and that led to the development of a whole new European toolbox of how to deal with Chinese investment, or more broadly at how to look at China's influence and how China uses its economic weight to, in our view, unlevel the global playing field. In the last years, Huawei has really put the issue of critical infrastructure on the agenda and led to a much more security-driven debate about critical infrastructure issues in Europe. That wasn't a big debate before here, and I guess from a US perspective, that has always or has been a surprise lately, that security doesn't play such a big role in European and German foreign policy. This year, the sanctions by China against European politicians, but also think tanks, including ours, Merix, has really put the political trajectory on a very bad footing. It has led to the shelving of the comprehensive agreement of investment indefinitely. And I think there are a lot of potential issues that are going to arise in the coming month and that the new administration will have to deal with. And while Angela Merkel's approach was always to smooth things over and depoliticize conflicts, I would anticipate that the new government will be more willing and maybe less disillusioned than Merkel was, more willing to find more fundamental political solutions to the issues that exist, to invest more in European unity and solidarity, to also invest more in the transatlantic partnership, as long as that holds as it currently seems to do, and to be much more willing to take China as the China that it is today, and that confronts us today. I'll leave it here for now and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernhard, for an excellent opening. I'm going to turn now to Eberhard. And can I ask you, Eberhard, in your opening remarks, to comment on whether you share the view that Bernhard just expressed, that there really has been a systematic evolution in German thinking. I think Bernhard used the term, Germans now see this as a systemic rivalry. There's been a real sobering up. Do you see it that way? And is this widely shared?
In that respect, Charlie, I would certainly agree with Bernhard, and thanks to Bernhard, we have, I think, a very useful structure for the debate. But let me start with a remark on systemic rivals. This has come into use in 2019 when the European Union, and shortly before that, the German BDI used this term, or the three expressions: partner, competitor, and systemic rival. To the best of my reading, China has been a systemic rival for us ever since October 1st, 1949, full stop. In the meantime, especially during the years Bernhard mentioned, during the so-called Merkel years now, we have perhaps had a too positive view of a still communist country, which is putting a lot of internal stress on maintaining stability at all costs, whether they meet Western expectations concerning human rights, concerning, for example, a level playing field in economics. They couldn't care less if they have the feeling that their own stability, domestic stability, and the party's claim for rule is at stake. And Bernhard made the first structural aspect looking at China. In my reading of China ever since 1978, not much has changed in that respect. Even Xi Jinping, whatever he is doing, he is always carefully watching the fact that he is not risking a loss of stability in any aspect of politics, business, or even control of society. And all the measures which we have been criticizing in our media over the last month can be read as attempts to increase the party's control. I'm also reading it as clear signs of a growing fragility and a growing nervousness within the top leadership elite in China, that they might not be able to manage all the risks they have to deal with one at a time. So the domestic situation in China is much more fragile, I would argue, than we usually seem to assume when we are watching the solid outward looking face of a communist system. The Merkel years, Bernard's second aspect, yeah, they have come under criticism because Merkel stressed economic relations and did not do much to, at least to manage all these other expectations, mainly focusing, for example, on human rights. And of course, it becomes clear that we have been dramatically misreading the potential for domestic change due to the fact that the economic rise of China was expected for most of us to lead to a kind of liberalization, perhaps even a few steps towards democracy, and this did not happen. And meanwhile, we are faced with an autocratic revival, also due to the pandemic and China's relative brutal success in dealing with this pandemic. But here we have the falling back into the confrontation between autocracies here and democracies there. So this is one of the challenges. And if I may say so, given all the debates we are finding in the media, for me, the most important challenge for all of us, both for the United States and for us in Europe, is the race for setting the standards in top-level technologies in the years ahead. China's program, China 2025, is a clear challenge. China 2035 adds to that. And just imagine, in automotive, you can already watch that companies like NIO do challenge our technological standards, for example, with swap technologies and including the increasing numbers of patents coming out of China. So this is an aspect of competition which will grow and which will continue to, well, create ever greater risks also for our companies. The fact that VW has been very successful on China's market, yeah, it's a fact of the past. Whether it will be a fact of the future is more than doubtful. So I would assume that systemic rivalry in that respect, also in the field of economic cooperation, will increase. What should we do? Define red lines? I'm absolutely skeptical whether that will work. I have spent days of my life, too many days of my life, sitting in dialogue formats with Chinese counterparts. It is boring, it is challenging, it is ineffective, it is a nuisance. But my question is there an alternative? Do we have an alternative? And that leads me to my last two remarks. One is referring, Bernard Bartra has given you all the details of our present state of the art of government formation. It is too early to tell. We do not know yet who will be responsible for the Foreign Office. All we can say is, and Bernard mentioned that, most probably China policy will be located in the Chancellor's office and not necessarily or primarily in the Foreign Office. And Olaf Scholz has, as a former mayor of the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, a record in pragmatically dealing with China. So I wouldn't expect too many changes coming from that side, but otherwise we will have to wait and see, assuming, as Bernard correctly said, that two China critical parties are entering government now, and you will see the effects in a few weeks, perhaps already. And finally, let us not forget that whenever we are debating our German perspective on China, there's always an invisible third party in the room, Charlie, and that is you, not you personally, but the United States. And of course, the American-China debate is heavily influencing also the debate we are having here. In my reading, it is much more, well, almost aggressive, certainly not as China-friendly as some of our European partners are. And we will have to deal with this in a transatlantic context as well. For the time being, what I'm reading is just admonitions we should work together. We should have a transatlantic agreement on how to deal with China, but I don't see very many things happening in that respect. And that is perhaps a concern. My personal concern is that we will have a difficult time with China in the years ahead, and a similarly difficult time with the United States. In 3 years from now, there will be an election for the next president. And what we are watching with a certain concern here in Europe is that a certain guy, obviously living not too far away from the place you are, Charlie, is getting ready and warming up for getting back to the White House. That would be a dramatic challenge for all of us, and China will certainly be part of that. I'll leave it at that and looking forward to the debate. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Eberhard, and also for bringing in the American perspective, which I will return to in our discussion. Over to you, Didi.
Right. Hi. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good afternoon. I don't know, Charlie, if you would like me to address any particular aspect, as you asked Eberhard too, but if not, then I'm happy to just give my general remarks. And I think, assuming that that's okay, great. So I think, we're in a state of considerable flux here right now in Berlin. That's clear. It's very unclear what's going to come out of this coalition negotiation. We're not even entirely sure whether it will succeed. Though it bets are that maybe it will. And we, as Eberhard said, we don't know who'll be foreign minister. My guess is that whoever is foreign minister, it's looking like the former foreign minister may have quite a role to play in the chancellery in terms of the future chancellery, should it be Olaf Scholz who is chancellor, in terms of being a foreign policy advisor to Scholz. Therefore, if I was the Greens foreign minister in waiting, Annalena Baerbock, I might say, well, actually, thank you very much. I don't want that position. So we'll see what happens. It's really quite messy. So that's the first point. Considerable flux, I think, right now, fair amount of internal dissent. I think that the SPD, Olaf Scholz's party, will try to, should it become them, will try to sort of dampen the enthusiasms of the FDP and the Greens, let's put it that way. And I think that they will find quite a bit of echo among some people in Brussels at the EU. I think that there is interest in getting this comprehensive agreement on investment, which was, of course, given the thumbs down by the European Parliament. This is a treaty, between the EU and Beijing, or, the agreement. I think there's quite some interest in achieving that on the ground de facto, whatever happens with the European Parliament, whether or not the agreement is eventually ratified. I think that there's also, we're looking at also in some ways a de facto adoption in Germany, I believe, of the notion of the de facto adoption of Belt and Road Initiative, which Germany, of course, hasn't signed it, isn't going to sign up to it. However, we are seeing de facto moves, including infrastructure, ports, etc. This is critical national infrastructure, and they are making deals with Chinese state-owned companies anyway. So there's a fair amount of de facto going on. And I would say that that's sort of the blast from the past. That's what we've had until now. That's been considered normal until now. But as Bernhard very correctly said, there is a lot of, there's been a lot of change. There's been quite an awakening here in some quarters. And the government itself, I believe, is, including the civil service, is quite split on this issue of how to deal with China. So it's too early to say what the next government will do. Second point I want to make is that long-term, so oder so, as we say in Germany, I think Germany needs to rethink. It's going to have to rethink its economic policy. And I don't say that just out of the blue. I'd like to quote here something that Angela Merkel, the chancellor who's now leaving, is a caretaker chancellor at this point, herself said recently in Tel Aviv. Now, these comments were not made in public in Germany. Unfortunately, she says rather less in Germany in terms of giving direction, perhaps, on China issues than one might sometimes have wanted, I think, particularly in terms of public education, democratic security, issues like that. But in Tel Aviv, she did unpack quite a bit, and that was very interesting. It came at a think tank meeting, and she actually talked about decoupling from China and said that although she wasn't in favor of total decoupling, she did see, and here I quote, then in fact one sees that due to the decisions made in China about who is allowed to provide services, internet services there, and what kind of information is the Chinese public allowed to access by its government, that we see in important areas a, quote, separate development between open societies and the Chinese society. And this is, quote, a bit inevitable. A little bit later, she spoke about quote, de facto decoupling, excuse me, and how do you create cooperation then in such a world that has de facto coupled a little bit to some extent. Now, this is really fascinating to me that she said this stuff in Tel Aviv. And I would like to also point out that another point she said is to do with the future German economy, of course, very important, is that she said quite rightly that we're headed towards an Internet of Things, yeah? So everyone sort of, everything has a chip. The chips are everywhere, more and more. Cars will become sort of chip-based in many important regards. And she actually said, can one build cars in China that use so many chips? Can, for example, Germany in future build cars in China if they use so many chips, given the connection between security, 5G issues, technology, the Internet of Things, given the way that the future is shaping up? And I think this is, a very profound question. And I was surprised to hear her raise it. And I think it points to certain forces in our societies which are kind of pushing us down this road, whatever happens, whatever people, would prefer or wouldn't prefer. So I think that that's my third point. My second point, excuse me. My third point, super briefly, is that what most concerns me, however, is the intervening years now, and between when that sort of de facto, as the caretaker chancellor put it, she said, a separate development or a de facto decoupling. Okay, the science and technology outflow from a country like Germany toward China over the next coming years. I think this is an area that also very much undermines Germany's sort of medium to long-term prosperity. And people talk about, we need international collaboration among scientists in order to do good science. This is of course true, but you don't necessarily have to collaborate with a system, for example, that operates off the basis of military-civil fusion, because you do need to ask security questions about the future. And I think that this is perhaps an area that for Germany is a little bit new, is a little bit unaccustomed. Germany hasn't, for the longest time, really been used to thinking in security terms. It's a very well-known fact. And it may be that there's a bit of a sort of cognitive shock coming up with some of these issues here. I do see pressure building in that sector too. So I guess I'll stop there. The technology, science and technology problem may seem like a kind of a technical science and technology problem. So in fact, very political, and it does relate to all kinds of policy decisions, including financial policy decisions and education policy, and of course, foreign policy decisions. So I'll stop there, and perhaps we'll have a chance to circle back with some of these questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Didi. Thanks to all three of you for excellent opening remarks and for staying on time. Let me pick up on a comment that Eberhard made and bring the United States more fully into the picture. And this is obviously a speculative question, but it's something that weighs on my mind. And that is, how much does America's political dysfunction and potential unreliability weigh on German and European thinking about China? Eberhard mentioned that I'm not too far from the former president, just so people know what he meant. I'm in Florida, and I'm not in the Trump part of Florida. I'm in the northwestern part of the state along the Gulf, and I can tell you it's very red. I arrived yesterday afternoon, and I have not seen a mask since I arrived. It's a very different kind of part of the United States than where I live in the Washington suburbs. And I have to say, it's an eye-opener, and it makes me wonder what's going to happen in the midterms, what's going to happen in 2024. We just saw elections in New Jersey and in Virginia that were, shall we say, sobering. And so how does this affect the debate in Berlin? If you have doubts about the reliability of the Atlantic connection, I would think that then that might push you to be more interested in maintaining a decent relationship with China. But listening to the three of you, that hypothesis doesn't seem to be the case. So I just want to float that out to get us going. Eberhard, since you raised the issue, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, Charlie, I don't think that concerns about transatlantic relations will lead at least a vast majority of politicians in Germany or Europe to be more friendly towards China. What I do see is still a disconnect on the political level between these. We do not have a community of values with China, full stop, and we will never have as long as this system is a communist one. But we do have a community of value with the United States. My concern, I share all the domestic concerns you just mentioned, Charlie, but my concern is that we have a more or less utopian perspective these days on the state of the art of transatlantic relations. We are thinking about the past. We know what we owe to the United States. We know that you were the guarantor of our security, but these times are over. And even under Joe Biden, it came to some of my transatlantically oriented colleagues as kind of a shock to realize that Joe Biden did not, from day one in office, change its economic policies or let the Europeans back in despite the pandemic. Whatever Trump had created in terms of frustrations for us, Joe Biden went on with them, slowly changing it, but that has created a kind of a concern that maybe transatlantic relations have substantially changed, not in a positive way. And if you take it for a moment an economic perspective, for most of our German companies, it is an unacceptable choice whether they want to be successful on the American market or on the Chinese market. Decoupling for our small and medium-sized enterprises is an existential danger, and they don't know what to do. And even our major global players are thinking about cutting their production lines either in the United States or in China, or separating them in order to avoid sanctions. So in business, this is a real dramatic development. Decoupling, by the way, has not been started by Donald Trump, but by our Chinese friends. They did not open internet, for example, for a global use, but they maintained their own Chinese version of an internet. And who is avoiding a level playing field for our companies while still using more or less open access to European markets? It's our Chinese friends. So let's be careful who started this business. But for business, it is really dangerous. And for politics, it is one of the core challenges of the years ahead.
Didi or Bernhard, would you like to make any comments on this issue of the transatlantic dimension?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in here. Thank you, Bernhard. I think that, Europe, Germany, the EU need to be really careful how they react to the United States going forward, should, for example, a Republican come back in 2024, not least because I see real potential here for powerful sort of centrifugal forces in the EU. Now, I'm thinking, for example, of Lithuania, I'm thinking of Estonia, I'm thinking of Czech Republic, where governments have come in that are making real changes in certain policies to do with China. Today, in fact, in Vilnius, the Taiwanese just opened the Taiwanese office, using the word Taiwan, albeit Taiwanese, not just Taiwan. It's not called the Taiwan Representative Office. It's called the Taiwanese Representative Office. And who came along to the opening was the first president of Lithuania after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Vytautas Landsbergis. He's 89 now. Now that's historical stuff. And, these states are very committed to support from the United States. They are strongly transatlantic. They are not humming and hawing and criticizing the United States, for this, that, and the other and everything. And Poland's another one. And I think that Europe needs to be really, really careful if it doesn't want to, frankly, just increase these sort of tensions that already exist within the EU, particularly, for example, when the EU smaller states see a country like Germany, which has kind of pursued its own interests very strongly in the EU for quite a few years now, to the point of there's been criticism of sort of Germany-driven, kind of post-financial collapse policies driving parts of the Greek economy into Chinese arms. I'm thinking of the Port Piraeus now, of course, 67% invested by Chinese state-owned enterprise shipping companies. So that would be kind of my comment on the future of the United States and the transatlantic relation. There's so much we can do to strengthen that relationship, but I think it will take quite clear-minded and sort of visionary leadership in Europe, frankly, as well, to achieve that and to understand sort of why it's a good idea perhaps to do so, despite the problems that may or may not come at us.
Bernhard, over to you. And in answering, maybe you could also throw a little bit of light on the issue that Didi raised about intra-European differences. How would you describe the main areas in which German policy and that of its partners in the EU are either the same or where they part company?
To start with that, it's often been said, and I think it's true, that any dynamics within the EU has usually been driven by a strong Franco-German partnership, and that will remain so. Although, especially when it comes to transatlantic partnership and China, Germany and France are not always entirely on the same page, and we've seen that in recent months. It's hard to overstate how shocked France was by the AUKUS deal, being kicked out of its partnership with Australia and the US brokering a deal between the UK, Australia and itself, and leaving the EU out of it. And that kind of brings back the skepticism that we've been accustomed to since the Trump years, the fundamental question of whether, despite our obviously very much overlapping values and so on, are Europe and the US in the same boat geopolitically, or are we not? It's been said, and I think that there's good evidence over the last month that, of course, a transatlantic China policy is one of the areas where there is real potential for cooperation. The transatlantic partnership is not an easy one, but our analysis of China and the role that it seeks to play in globalization, and that is very adversarial to us and very detrimental to our interests, that is something we share. There have been important steps over the last couple of months. There has been the establishment of the Transatlantic Technology Council, for example. It's a good format. It needs to be filled with substance now. There has been the Airbus-Boeing deal, a decade-old conflict, trade conflict that seems to be resolved now, not entirely, but on a way to being resolved. And that is, of course, because now both sides are factoring in China. The transatlantic Airbus-Boeing deal is de facto a Boeing-Airbus COMAC deal. It wouldn't have been possible without China. The same goes for the recent deal on steel tariffs. It's the longest running WTO conflict between Europe and the US. Again, all of a sudden, cooperation seems possible. And all of that is because there's an awareness that if the US and Europe work together and other like-minded countries, then there is a possibility to balance China's power and to protect multilateral institutions or global institutions and so on. But then there are issues like AUKUS or Afghanistan that are troubling. I think the fundamental difference that is hard for Europeans to play a strong role in is that, of course, the US view towards China is one of much more fundamental political and especially military rivalry than we in Europe see it. We have no competition with China over who is the leading world power and who is the military power in the Pacific. We have interests in that, and we should be much more aware that stability in the Indo-Pacific area or in the Pacific area is something that has a lot of relevance for our prosperity, economic well-being, and so on. But we are not really the player there. And therefore, of course, the US is in the driving seat. And just to finish off on that, Europe, or the EU and the US now both have these tripartite strategies towards China. In Europe, it's China is a partner and a competitor and a rival, and that is pretty descriptive. While the US view is much more prescriptive, seeing China or describing it as cooperate with China where you can, compete where necessary, and confront China where you must. And especially if you take the rivalry part, and Eberhard has mentioned that, yes, China has been a rival there, but the US can actually say we need to confront China and has means to do that. Whether successfully remains to be seen. In Europe, we are still struggling with trying to find out what it means to see China as a rival and to take that role seriously and react to that.
Let me pick up on your last point, Bernhard, and drill down a little bit on this, the geopolitical question, in the sense that the AUKUS deal, even if it made sense strategically, and we could always discuss that, but I don't want to go there right now, did underscore the degree to which there is a huge asymmetry in the American engagement in geopolitics and the European engagement. Is there a debate in Germany about deeper geopolitical involvement of either Germany individually or the EU collectively in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific? Or do you sense that Germany will be much more comfortable saying, we'll deal with human rights, we'll deal with trade, we'll deal with cyber and other economic issues, but we're going to leave the geopolitics to the United States? Is that a fair summary of where we are? Maybe Bernhard, you could quickly respond, and I'll turn to the other two.
Just very quickly, I think the two big buzzwords in Germany and in Brussels are currently Indo-Pacific strategy and connectivity. Indo-Pacific strategy meaning a little bit different things in France and in Germany. In France, it has more of a security aspect. For Germany, it has more, and it's more diversifying our relations with like-minded countries in Asia, but that is a big push. The other, connectivity, is basically finding a reply to the Belt and Road Initiative. It was launched as connectivity strategy in, I think, 2018, wasn't a big success. It's now rebranded as Global Gateway, and the EU is starting to put money behind that. That's basically about competing with China in third markets economically and technologically and in setting standards. But as you see from that, we are mainly dealing with diplomatic and economic ties here. The whole military and security aspect, from a German perspective, we are still largely tone deaf in that area.
Didi?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think tone deaf is I mean, I don't even know about tone deaf. I think maybe quite deaf, really. You know, because and I mean that kindly. I just think that we really are. I've seen Germany. I think that, you know, it takes a long time to change, maybe to change social attitudes, to change the systems in which they're embedded, to change. I mean, you can't change the history out of which these have grown. That's obvious. And it takes political will, and it takes a certain type of leadership, I think, in order to bring about those changes. And so I think that's the first question, is we have to see whether or not the upcoming government will have that political leadership and sense of responsibility about protecting democracy more strongly, I believe, in Europe. Because, of course, we're talking about China, but let's not forget, for Germany, Russia's a really big issue, and even more so for Lithuania and Estonia and Czech Republic and all those places. I mean, that's really breathing down their necks. We've got the situation now in Poland with the Belarusian border, really nasty, whereby, you know, Lukashenko, Belarusia's president, is essentially bussing in people, flying them in, poor victims, you know, from the Middle East to populate the border, and the Polish army is trying to keep them out of Poland. This is really unpleasant. And what I see happening in Germany is kind of to be honest, a kind of an underreaction. I agree it's a very difficult situation, but this gets back to Bernhard's point about the rather sort of deafness towards sort of security issues, which is very evident here. And I think I think that also is a very powerful determinant. That sort of deafness, if you like, or tone deafness, is a very powerful determinant also in a whole range of issues in Germany right now when it comes to dealing with the challenge of the Communist Party of China. I think we see it in civil society. I think we see it in business. And I think that my response to the issue of certainly the issues of small and medium enterprises that Eberhard raised, absolutely, there are thousands of those which have production facilities or other sorts of businesses in China, very aware of that. And the answer, I think, isn't decoupling, even if Angela Merkel is starting to go there herself in her thoughts. You know, the answer is clearly diversifying. And how do you do that? You know, well, you need support. Look, you're not going to be able to do that. A nice family company in Baden-Württemberg is not going to be able to suddenly decouple from China, but they can be supported to diversify to other places, whether that's Japan or Malaysia or elsewhere. I don't know, maybe even in Europe, for example, through government policy, taxation policy, investment policy, all kinds of issues like that. And I don't see that push coming. I don't see much discussion of such a possibility yet. But again, it's very difficult to say because we are still waiting for a new government to come in.
Eberhard, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to comment on the geopolitical issue, but also, since Didi just raised it, maybe take the discussion into this whole decoupling debate. The word is thrown around a lot. I have a hard time imagining it because, you know, we are in the globalization boat together, right? Germany's largest trading partner is China. America's third largest trading partner is China. 2/3 of the world trades more with China than with the United States. And so it's hard for me to imagine that we go down a decoupling road except in, you know, AI and semiconductors and maybe some pharmaceuticals. Other than that, it seems that it's just not on. But I'd like your thoughts on both the geopolitics and the
Charlie, I'll come back to geopolitics in a minute. But as far as this decoupling is concerned, well, we are watching China going on a more or less isolationist road down the coming years with the two circles of external relations and domestic relations. This is not really challenging economic theory, but it is a clear indication that China has a big domestic market and seems to believe that, at least in a certain aspect, it can rely on this domestic market, adding to a process of deglobalization, which is basically behind decoupling. And I also agree with Didi. It's not up to the small and medium-sized enterprises to solve this problem. They cannot do that. They are too weak. They need political protection. They also need political protection against sanctions, for example. And that is the great concern, that while doing business with one country, China has just confronted us with an anti-sanction law, So whatever you do, dealing with one side means you are getting into difficulties with the other side. This is more than small and medium, even larger companies, even global players can afford if they want to survive successfully. As far as geopolitics,
clear, are you talking about like sanctions vis-a-vis labor in Xinjiang, these sorts of issues?
yeah, you have American sanctions against doing business with Russia, Iran, and China. That
Okay.
is, for some of our companies, a challenge, like it or not. As far as geopolitics is concerned, Charlie, a few years ago, no one in Germany even used the term geopolitics for a simple historical reason. In the time of National Socialism, we had a certain Karl Haushofer who was trying to use geopolitical ideas to legitimize what the Nazis did, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Geopolitics, therefore, that's a big difference to the American debate. Geopolitics in English, in the American debate, always was a very normal term. In Germany, it was different, but we have learned that geopolitics is coming back. And of course, we have also learned that if you want to take a geopolitical perspective or a global perspective, you also have to be willing to bear the costs. And that is something our politicians are very reluctant to do. It's a very normal lesson. If you want to be globally active, you have to be able to afford the costs. Now, I agree with both Bernhard and Didi Tadlo. Europe and Germany certainly, but Europe does not have a security perspective on China or even East Asia. We are talking a little bit about the South China Sea, but one German frigate in the area is not really changing the balance of power, is it? It's more symbolic. We want to make clear to our American allies, yes, we are standing at your side, but basically we do not feel threatened by China in very general terms. And we do not have a military perspective on China. And that is a clear difference to the American debate, where your military leaders are clearly focusing on a trans-Pacific potential of war. Take Graham Allison and his Thucydides' trap as just one example. And finally, I would be a little bit more skeptical about European wording, buzzwords and strategy papers. If they would represent the real world, the world would look completely differently. But having these three terms of partner and competitor and rival over and over again in different order, it doesn't really change much. It's being quoted, and it's only this one sentence and not the rest of the paper, which is being quoted again and again and again. And buzzwords don't make a strategy. And Europe doesn't have a strategy, and everything that has been said from Lithuania to Poland and to Southern Europe, to Greece and Italy, clearly demonstrates Europe is not able, as we are speaking today, to formulate a concise, coordinated strategy, not even towards the United States, but certainly not towards China.
Bernhard, I believe you'd like to jump in on the decoupling issue.
Thank you. Quickly on the buzzwords, though, just to make one point, especially on the term of rivalry, to show that it, in my view, really does matter. Not that it's changed reality, but bringing up the term rival has, on the one hand, really offended Beijing, and they're running big diplomatic campaigns in order to suppress that word and that thinking of China as a rival. They didn't like competitor. And 4 years ago, before the German Federation of Industries put the competitive issue on the table, talking about China was all about partnership. Even the competitive issue wasn't there in the public arena. China hated that, and especially hates the rivalry issue. Now, that is successful, and it has been successful in particular with Angela Merkel. She is the one powerful European leader who has never used the term rival vis-a-vis China. Other German ministers have. She has refused to do so, undermining, in a way, European unity there, because, for example, Macron has done that. So I think it's important to have these words because it shifts thinking and debates. Very quickly on decoupling, because we've done some studies in that respect, agree with all the points made. Just to illustrate a bit for German and European companies, decoupling hasn't led to what could have been expected, withdrawing from China and going other places. It's actually led to more localization. The European company and China story is a localization story. COVID-19 and China's sealing off from travel and so has supported that.
Could you explain what you mean by localization?
Localization, hiring more local staff, but at the same time, decoupling their Chinese business a bit from global value chains. And I think that's the second important point there. Business in China for these companies is now much more, again, for the Chinese market, which is huge and which is still growing by the size of one Australia every year. There is no second China for these companies. But China nowadays doesn't play the role that they had in mind a couple of years ago, and that China had in mind a couple of years ago, of fully integrating Chinese production sites into global value chains. Because if you look, for example, at technology companies that supply certain car parts, a German car part supplier can no longer be sure that car parts that he produces in China would be accepted in cars sold in the US market. So they'll have to source that from somewhere else. So they're starting to begin to kind of decouple their value chains into the Western one and one geared to the Chinese market. That is incredibly expensive. It's totally redundant. It's incredibly ineffective. And it's not what globalization was meant to be, but it's starting to be a reality for German companies. The question then is, even if China goes down the trajectory that we're seeing, that they'll maybe produce there for the Chinese market, but must anticipate that they'll be squeezed out. They will only play the role in China that they play now in 5 or 10 years if China fails with its industrialization strategy. If Made in China 2025 fails, they will still be in this powerful spot that they're having now as supplying key technologies. If China is halfway successful, and we've done studies about that, their Chinese market share is going to shrink. The question is the rest of the world big enough for them? And are they going, like how big is the partnership, and how level is the playing field outside China? And there, of course, the US market plays a huge role. And that's where the situation of European companies and US companies is different, because US companies have much more political support that they can take for granted on the global markets than European companies. For European companies, the fear of the last years has been being pushed out of China, but also being seen as a competitor by the US. And the Trump years have shown the whole toolkit that the US might use there. And knowing that Europe and the US are in the same boat would make all the difference. But looking at the internal political debates in the US, that is nothing that German companies are betting all their money on at the moment.
Let me invite participants to submit questions in the Q&A. I've already begun to integrate them into the conversation, but please do jump in if you have questions. I'm going to one quick question before I turn to a few questions from the Q&A. Am I correct, Bernhard, that your point that you just made is basically the same as the one that Eberhard was made about the domestic market becoming much more seminal in our considerations of China than the traditional Chinese as the engine of a globalized market? You're both making a similar point, am I correct?
Yes,
and that the German companies are trying to stay in there as a producer for domestic consumption in Germany.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to go to Didi next because I see her hand up, but I also want to put out a couple of questions from the Q&A. One is on the whole electrification of the automotive industry. How is that going to affect Germany? Does Germany and large auto companies, do they feel threatened by where China is on production of batteries? And then the other question, unrelated, is, actually it is kind of related, but it's the Greens and climate. How might the Greens and their representation in the new German government affect Chinese policy, given their concerns on the environment? Didi, I'm going to turn to you since you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just really wanted to make a kind of a sort of a long-term historical observation, if I may, to take us away from the daily politics of it all. And I think that is that, you know, if you take the historical view, globalization is not inevitable, right? It's these globalization processes, they rise and fall. I've even heard, when I was still living in China as a journalist, I even heard a whole bunch of officials there from the Communist Party officials say, they describe the whole British colonial era as an era of globalization. I thought that was quite funny. And I think they were trying to be polite because they were trying to do a deal. It was an art deal. But anyway, so, you know, it depends how you sort of term these things, of course. But I think that globalization isn't something that we should necessarily expect will inevitably go on forever. You know, it could well fall off now and be replaced by something else. I'm not commenting on whether that's good or bad, but it's just an observation. And the other thing I wanted to just briefly say was that in her talk in Tel Aviv, Angela Merkel did say that decoupling, a word she used reluctantly but did use, was not just driven by the United States, but also by China, which is defining its own space and access. So its own space, we see that legally in all kinds of ways now, and also practically, politically. But access, she meant, what access do we have? What access do our internet companies have? What access does anyone have, really, increasingly? You know, that's definitely shrinking. And so that's just something kind of, I guess, to keep in mind, is that we, you know, in terms of issues such as, you know, future trade, you know, Germany, yes, Germany is China's largest trading partner, but it's only its largest nation state trading partner by a very, very large margin. The EU is Germany's largest single trading partner. Now, if you're going to talk about economic blocks. So again, in terms of globalization, yeah, I suppose we're looking at more localization just around the, you know, in many areas, most likely. But thanks. I just wanted to make those comments. I'm not going to address the questions. I thought I might leave that to other people.
Bernhard,
Okay, Charlie.
why don't you go first, Eberhard?
Yes, the automotive issue. Charlie, you were asking, should German car companies be afraid of China, right? My answer is very simple. They better do be afraid. China's companies, we have more than 100 EV startups in China these days. And some of the companies are already known by name, BYD, Geely, or NIO for that matter. Let me give you the NIO perspective. They started 5 years ago, went to the New York Stock Exchange 3 years ago, almost went bankrupt last year, and are now worth $80 billion. This month, while we are speaking, they are opening their first operation in Norway. They are coming through Europe via Norway because in their perspective, Norway is the easiest access market throughout Europe. They have already indicated that by December next year, they will open their business in Germany. They come step by step, and they come with a technology which has failed once, swap technology, exchanging whole batteries instead of waiting hours and hours and hours to reload your batteries. They are swapping batteries within 3 to 5 minutes, which is the usual time you are spending at your tech station. That is the technology they are using. And of course, they are already offering you to choose the strength of your battery, whether you want to have 75 or 100 kilowatt hours. That is all unknown technology on the German market. And they do push towards Europe. And of course, they also push on their own home market. This little company, 3 years old, has already 500 swap stations throughout China, 1 in Norway, 0 so far in Germany. In next year, the numbers will be dramatically different. And as we all know, our Chinese friends have a tendency of taking it slowly, very pragmatically, step by step. I would not be as sure as some of our automotive managers that the future is bright and rosy for German companies, given this growing competitiveness of China. And on a broader perspective,
the presence in Norway, is that just going to be retail to sell finished products, or is it research, manufacturing? Is it broader than retail?
Their design center is located in Munich, in Germany, ever since 2015. And Norway is, of course, the first market. They want to bring new cars onto the streets of Norway beginning next year, and the same in Germany. On a more general level, I remember debates with generally the German machine builders, for example, who 10 years ago argued it is our task. We have to defend our capacity to be more effective, technologically more advanced than our competitors in China. That is not happening anymore, as far as I can see. The Chinese have caught up, and they will continue to catch up. And that is the challenge for all of our business, especially the technology-oriented, future-oriented business. These competitions from China will be disastrous, potentially disastrous for us. And I'm not sure whether many of even our business leaders, not to mention our political leaders, really have got this lesson.
Bernhard.
I agree. And actually at Merix, we've recently done a study that really supports all of these arguments. China or Chinese e-vehicle makers, of course, have the advantage of a huge home market and all the subsidies that they get there, and the political support. The question for me is whether e-vehicles are really the frontier in where the automotive industry is going, and whether batteries are going to be a critical part that China can dominate, or whether it's not going to be a global commodity, because Korea and Japan are also very good in that. There's strong competition, for example, for raw materials there, and China is of course politicizing these markets. But generally, I think the much more interesting question for the automotive industry is autonomous driving and the whole data-driven aspect of future cars. And there, I think the situation is much more difficult, because there we get into all the discussions about data security, data sharing, and so on, where it will be much harder for Chinese companies to get a foothold in Europe or in the US, and where actually a lot of the development is still coming out of the US, but also from Germany, from Bosch, for example. And very quickly on the question on climate change, China has its fight against climate change agenda and the 2060 goals, because climate change is going to have devastating effects on China itself. It's nothing that China does in order to cooperate with Western countries. It's pure Chinese self-interest to stop that. So all cooperation and positive signals in Glasgow need to be taken with that grain of salt, although that is meaningful. But there is going to be strong competition in green tech. And I think that the green tech competition will be just as fierce as economic competition in all sectors. And China is again going to use all in its toolbox that we have seen in the last years, and that I think we need to take very, very seriously.
Eberhard, did you want to jump back in?
Just since Bernard mentioned autonomous driving, this is a very important aspect, which also clearly shows the level of competition we have to face in the future. When it comes to autonomous driving, I'm referring to a long debate with leading Bosch managers. There is a basic difference between China's approach and our Western or German car producers' approach. German car producers want to build all the needed artificial intelligence technology into the car and allow the car to steer through the traffic. The Chinese are taking a completely different perspective. They are building the necessary AI infrastructure into the street infrastructure, allowing externally to manipulate the cars. Who will finally define the standard on a global level? That is one of the competitions we have to face, and it's a clear indication. We have mentioned China 2025. For me, China 2035 is a much bigger challenge, because this is when China wants to reach the level of setting global standards, whether we like it or not. The good old times where the German DIN standards had a global impact seem to be over, at least in the perspective of our Chinese competitors. And automotive driving is a wonderful example how these competition develops and how the competition is pushed, as Bernard said, by the support of the Chinese state for all companies involved in this competition. And our companies, well, in my reading, they are more or less left alone by political support. There's not enough political support to help master this challenge.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I did. I really agree with the point about future technology, green tech, and the competition in that field. And from my own research, it's clear for how long actually China's whole system of technology spotting and extraction and transfer from the industrialized developed nations of the world, including Japan and South Korea, has worked to, in very forward-looking ways, for example, new materials, precisely this kind of green tech sort of stuff. Medical technology is a huge issue, biotech. And it seems to me that we know how this technology is being extracted from Europe. And I would say here that Germany, outside of the United States, is probably the single largest source of foreign technology for China still. The European Union, of course, put together is larger than Germany on its own, but in terms of just simple nation states. And I think that, we have identified 32 methods whereby the Communist Party of China is working to extract technology. The whole thing's been studied, and it's legal, it's illegal, and it's gray zone. And what's worrying to me indeed is that we don't yet have a real enough sense of the risks ahead for our own economies here in Europe, particularly in Germany. And we are not responding by saying, you know what, this future technology, which we have, after all, in Germany, has put so much money into creating it in terms of educating people, in terms of building a society, of investing in ourselves, in our own knowledge structures, to be able to produce this very innovative technologies. And this goes back decades, of course, that we're not protecting it enough. We're still sort of laboring in an old mindset of, let's go and develop China, or let's just give everything away, right? So I think, looking forward, it's not just everything that has flowed from Germany to China already in terms of technology. It's also the future flow. I think exactly that. And that's something, again, where I would just hope for a little bit of more support from the future German government to identify and work against this problem. And I think this is something that would naturally improve transatlantic ties. inevitably.
We only have about 10 minutes left. I want to broach two final topics and then have the three of you respond. One is just to give us an update on some of the multilateral economic initiatives. The investment treaty, is that dead? What's the state of play? Where are we on CPTPP? Is there a debate on these initiatives right now, or are we basically pushing such things off? And then secondly, and to end with, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how German analysts and German politicians see America's China policy. Does it look like we have a China policy? If we do, is it too competitive, not competitive enough, not fleshed out? Where are there areas of agreement? Where are there areas of tension? It's clear that Biden wants to forge a united front of democratic states when it comes to China. It's not clear to me how successful he's been on that front. So those are our two final issues. Who would like to start us off?
Yes, I'm just checking on my mic. The first question, the future of CAI, very briefly, dead. I don't think that it will go anywhere. The blockades are too big for good reasons on both sides. It was pushed through, especially by the often mentioned German chancellor, but it's running in so many difficulties on the European level that it will in the end be a dead initiative, and we'll have to see whether there will be enough energy on both sides to restart the whole process. On the perspective of US-China policy, what we of course do observe is two things. As we already said, the American-China policy is definitely much more security oriented, and in that respect, a little bit more aggressive in our perspective than our European one. On the other hand, it seems to be one of the very, very few bipartisan issues where the American political system still finds kind of an agreement or a willingness to cooperate. I don't see many domestic issues, and certainly also not many foreign policy issues where Republicans and Democrats do cooperate in the way they do when it comes to dealing with China. The risk, however, is that things might go wrong. The former commander-in-chief of American forces in Europe, who is now living in Frankfurt, is expecting a military confrontation between China and the United States within the next 5 years. That is a clear indication that there is a perspective of risk. We Europeans don't have to be part of it, but we will be part of the consequences of such a conflict, and that is one of the concerns we certainly have when watching US-China policies.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think from what I see here in Germany is a very much a perception of the United States as being involved in some sort of great power posturing vis-a-vis China, rather than looking at the actual issues and the actual values that we're talking about here. I think that, great power competition is definitely part of it. That's sort of hardwired into it, if you like. And I think part of that is, of course, because the United States has had enormous responsibility in the world, has provided a security umbrella for very many places, including China indirectly, but in which it has flourished. Yeah, the other countries have flourished in many ways, many of them anyway. And so I think that this sort of, but I think that what's going on between the US and China isn't just about great power posturing or great power competition. I think it is a values issue. And I think it might be important to perhaps communicate that a bit more here in Germany, that people in the US, I think, are actually worried about the realities of what are going on. The 1.8 million Uyghurs who've been sort of cycled through whichever re-education camps. Some have ended up in prisons and some have gone back home. Some are now forced labor. The fate of Hong Kong. These things are actually values issues. That would be my first point, that I would hope that it could be seen a little bit more like that. And in fact, I think I'll I'll stay with that. I don't deny that there is, there are valid concerns about overreach in some ways with the US. Has it bitten off more than it can chew right now, taking on China? How is Europe going to respond? Will Europe step up? Will it finally, do something about dealing with Russia better? I don't, talk about a European army is fascinating to me because you have 27 languages for a start, or maybe 26, because Ireland and Malta both speak English. But you have a really lot of different languages, and you have zero interoperability for whatever national armies exist. I mean, this is a really, really huge challenge to even think about a European army. So what are the realistic options for Europe, So yeah, I'll end on that realistic note.
Bernhard, you get the final word.
Thank you. On the comprehensive agreement on investment, I wouldn't say it's entirely dead. I would say it's in a coma, and the discussion is whether to turn off the machines or not. There is still interest to revive it, especially on the Chinese side. And the whole thing was revived because China, after 7 years of negotiation, did make some concessions, at least on paper, that then for the German side were very difficult to ignore. China coming saying, you've wanted this and this and this, and now we're giving it to you. How could you now not pursue this? However, the whole value of the agreement, the benefits it would bring, are much less obvious now a year later than they were a year ago, because a lot of it was only small market openings anyway. A lot of those have been granted anyway. So it's purely a political instrument now. There was the question about broader free trade agreements. It would be very necessary for the rest of the world to really work against this, what's been called patchwork globalization, and make sure that we level the playing field outside China for ourselves as much as possible. But free trade agreements are not very popular in the West either, and I don't see any of that happening very soon. I don't think any agreements between developed OECD standard nations and China that may carry the name to be very meaningful either. On US-China policy, I think I've already said that the basic analysis is the same. Of China, the focus is much different because Europe is not a security player. There are catalogs full of recommendations and common projects that could be pursued transatlantically. Some have actually been pursued already, and that's very encouraging. There is much more that I think can be done. The big question for Europe will be, what is the role that it can play in the big power game that the US and is playing and anticipating with China, and that needs to be a role that Europe can actually fulfill. It's quite obvious that the US is demanding something from Europe, and Europe in a way has to acknowledge that it needs to be more responsible for its own security, for example, in its neighborhood. On the other hand, expecting more from Europe than it can deliver can also lead to very unfortunate dynamics that could actually put more pressure on the partnership than do good for it.
Let me end simply by thanking the Asian Studies Program, the BMW Center, and the Initiative for US-China Dialogue at Georgetown for bringing us together. It's been an excellent discussion, and I particularly want to thank Didi and Bernhard and Eberhard for taking time to join us today. Thanks very much. Nice to see all of you. I think this conversation is not over. It's just beginning. So I look forward to continuing it, hopefully in person next time that we gather. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks again.